Pues díselo a Tom, por favor. Díselo a Tom, por favor, que no hay premios.
We're trying to figure. We're going to wait a little bit because we're trying to locate Marcel with the prices.
Okay.
He's okay with the price.
Ah, he's just telling me he stole it.
He ran away.
He is the prize.
He ran away finally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Marcelo is missing. Ahora. Porque ellos van a hablar allí.
This is the worst microphone.
Yes, but I'll stand up just for my 1 minute.
You can have two.
Can I have two? I don't know.
Yeah. They will take.
Jokes and things.
Debe pasar. Estoy intentando ser lo más natural posible en inglés.
You really, really deserve that.
There in every pool of this town, but I'm very happy to get it. And I'm also very happy. About all the tour because I like him stuff. And listen to all the people who decided. And in the final, I support them. His own vanity. It's nobody's sure but he it's nice to get anything to me.
Trying to do something international.
It's not clear in the wording of the word is very strange concept. It's European Anyway, I will make a crack about
This is the film.
Yes.
Come to the authors meets critics later.
Okay, I give you for.
Yeah, thanks for coming. They've stolen your prize. They've stolen your prize.
What can you expect from an Argentine? The Swiss you might hope for better.
Luis va para allá. Sorry?
Yes. I mean, if it's still here, that would detract from the
Yesterday night he was okay.
Yeah.
Until 7:30 I think he was okay. and
one.
And then they give it to him because he's here as well.
Yeah, but he stays.
And then
You announce, they make the laudatio, and then you go home. You give him the award, and he stays for the main speech.
before his speech he gets the award.
The laudatio.
After laudatio, before the laudatio.
After the laudatio and before the speech.
Okay?
The winner is Michael Conway, and so Letizia will make Letizia makes the laudatio, and then you go, and the three of you together make the picture, and he gives the speech.
Yes, after
The miracle sign after a very lengthy discussion.
Okay.
It's all protocol and procedure.
Sí.
It's there and it's there. It's the cup final, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Maybe I was
Hello, everybody. Hello, dear colleagues. Welcome to today's plenary session. Thank you so much for your attendance and for choosing to visit the beach at another time. And I hope you are enjoying not only the conference, but also our lovely city. The Malaga team is delighted to share these academic and party moments with all of you. Thank you very much for being here. We are going to start this plenary session with the presentation of two awards. First, the president of the jury of the ESC European Criminology Award, Professor Tom van der Beken, will take the floor. Please, Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I have the honor and the privilege and the pleasure. Is no microphone on?
You have been silenced, Tom.
No prize.
No prize.
No, okay. So, try again. The honor and the privilege and the pleasure to chair the jury of the European Criminology Award 2021. The jury was composed of the past presidents Leslie Macara, Alexandra Stobrininas, and myself. And we unanimously decided to award the European Criminology 2020 prize to Michael Levy. He's going to get the prize physically, but first there will be laudatio presented by my colleague Letizia Paoli. So Letizia, you have the floor for the laudatio.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, there are multiple reasons to explain why Michael Levy fully deserves the European Criminology Award of the European Society of Criminology. Since the slides? Can you put the slides on, please? Yeah, wonderful. Since the 1980s, he has been the criminologist, certainly in Europe, but probably also worldwide, that has most persistently and systematically investigated fraud, corruption, and money laundering. Fraud, in particular, has, since the advent of mass internet banking and shopping at the start of this century, become the most common type of crime for gain. Unlike drugs and other illicit markets, it has not attracted much crime control expenditure from government. Yet, it is now acknowledged in the media and in the policy and practitioner spheres, as well as by many criminologists, that this is an important area of criminal activity, generating huge economic, social costs, and raising questions of elite social impunity and legitimacy, as well as insecurities about cybercrime in many parts of the world. Michael Levy has attempted to fill some major gaps in our knowledge and understanding of these phenomena and of the ways in which they are controlled, generating fresh data, producing innovative theorizing and rigorous empirical analysis, and offering much needed policy guidance. His substantial oeuvre of books, articles, and research studies has contributed significantly to both academic and policy development. In a European and indeed global context, always focus on European evidence by using American, Asian, and Australian data for comparative insight. Among the most significant, next slide, please.
You have to press the top left.
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you. Yeah. Among the most significant theoretical contribution he has made in a range of difficult fields, perhaps the greatest was to create, in his doctoral research in the early 70s, a routine activity theory avant la lettre. His thesis was then shortened and published as Phantom Capitalism, the Organization and Control of Long-Term Fraud in 1981. His study related patterns of bankruptcy fraud to the business cycles and to both the standard and explicitly counter-fraud efforts of business credit controllers from the mid-19 onwards, relying on interviews with fraudsters, police, tax investigators and liquidators, as well as credit control agencies. Professor Levy showed the dynamics of the arms race between fraudsters and target victim companies and third-party credit rating agencies. In particular, he revealed how many white-collar fraudsters could evade police actions, which were, and 50 years later still are, largely focused on the usual suspects, that is, those the police views as organized criminals. The book was republished in a revised and expanded second edition in 2008, which also received much praise. His 50-year-long research on fraud also constitutes Professor Levy's most significant empirical contribution. In a string of articles, books, and reports, he has described and explained the organization and control of a range of frauds, from elite, kleptocrat, and corporate executive embezzlement to more banal credit card fraud. And he has also shown how the proceeds of crime are handled and how frauds are informally and formally managed by potential victims and by the criminal justice and the state regulatory system. Another important contribution to the literature on fraud and broader white-collar crime research has been his work on jury decision-making in complex fraud cases and sentencing and other sanctioning in white-collar crime cases. Some paradoxes explored in his past and ongoing work, starting from Regulating Fraud, second major book which was published in 1987 and was then republished in 2013. So some of these paradoxes include the lack of service given by the police to businesses that suffer frauds, the lack of follow-up to report the suspicions of money laundering, the difficulties experienced by citizens and victims in funding individuals and corporations to hold accountable for social harms. Mike Levy argues that this is attributable less to the public perceptions of economic crime seriousness than to the police and political resistance to shifting their limited resources to new areas that require different skills, sets, and relationships. My theoretical and empirical work has not been restricted to fraud. In areas that are often ideology and rhetoric rich, but evidence light, Mike has sought to enhance the evidence base in the following interrelated areas of scholarship. First, scoping the extent and examining the patterns of the organization of serious crime for gains, for example, drugs, fraud, and also money laundering, including the contribution of cybercrime, ICT, and of professionals such as lawyers and accountants to this process. Second, he has also described clearly and evaluated the impact of terrorist finance and money laundering controls and proceeds of crime confiscation on fraud, drug trafficking, environmental crime, and terrorism. Third, he has assessed the cost of cybercrime for the UK and worldwide, and the cost of organized crime in an important report for the European Parliament for the EU. Fourth, he has analyzed, explained, and critiqued, given a contribution to analysis, explanation, and critique of the global trends in money laundering, its controls, and its effectiveness. Testifying his worldwide reputation, a recent article of his on money laundering won the Best Article Prize from the Asian Criminology Society. Indeed, more generally, Mike's work is extensively cited and has received significant scholarly attention and praise. He has been awarded numerous prizes and awards, such as the Frida Eller Distinguished Award back in 2001, the Distinguished Scholar Award of the International Association for the Study of Organized Crime in 2013, the Selling Gluck Award of the American Society of Criminology in 2014, the Outstanding Achievement Award of the British Society of Criminology in 2019, and the Lifetime Achievement Award in the first Tackling Economic Crime Award in 2019, and 2 years ago he also received the 2020 Anti-Corruption Excellence Award in the category of academic research and education. Given Mike's multifaceted and unique expertise, it is no surprise that Professor Levy's academic analytical skills have been sought by numerous governments and international organizations, including the UK Home Office, the Council of Europe, the European Commission and Parliament, Europol, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and the US National Academy of Science. His work on public-private partnership in the control of fraud or money laundering, for example, has helped to reorient thinking in the UK, the EU, and internationally towards a closer relationship between the state and the private sector. Mike has also shaped the first Home Office organized crime strategy, introducing a novel and, in my opinion, courageous focus on harm, and through his collaboration with British policymakers, he also impacted very positively on the first EU initiatives on organized crime. But alas, that was before Brexit stroke. And but then while these are, so to say, the serious academic reason for granting Mike the ESC most prestigious award, there are other two less academic ones that I would nonetheless like to mention in my laudatio. The first of these reasons has very much to do with the qualifying adjective of our society. We are the European Society of Criminology. And testifying to such a European spirit, Mike was a founding member of the society. He has sat twice on the board of the society, coordinated the organization of the Cardiff Conference a few years back, and he has also attended almost all conferences of our society. But in addition to that, over the years, Mike has made an impressive effort to learn a few words and make small talk in at least 10 European languages. Considering that Mike's native language is English, the lingua franca of contemporary academia, this effort is even more remarkable and worth our special appreciation, as it shows Mike's great humanity and kindness. Last but not least, I'd like to mention Mike's fantastic irony and wit. It's a pleasure to listen to him and to read his text, not only for the important topics he discusses, his analytical acumen and valuable finding, but also for his frequent quips and more or less explicit jokes. Let me just mention in closing some of my preferred quotes. I still remember that the first paper that I read from Mike when I was still a student at the University of Firenze or Florence was entitled Pecunia non olet, cleansing the money launderers from the temples. This was one of the very first analyses of money laundering controls worldwide, and its title contained not just one, but two jokes. For years, I've also been citing Mike's presentation of organized crime as a Rorschach blot, whose attraction, as well as its weakness, and this is a quote, is that one can read almost anything into it. More recently, my preferred quip has come from an article on the cost of fraud that Mike co-authored in 2008 with John Burroughs. In such article, Mike and his co-authors, among other, asked, consider whether the cost of response to crime should be added to the cost of crime as it is conventional, especially in the economic literature. And then they add a clever slide footnote asking this consideration prompts new questions such as whether victimization service should be defined as a cost of crime, and indeed, and that's crucial for us, should the production of this paper and the whole criminological estate be thus included. Well, I hope that being labeled as a potential cost of crime will not weaken your enthusiasm in congratulating Mike for his outstanding work and for the important award that he receives today.
Okay, does this work? Yes, I think so. Howard Becker started, or rather ended, his labeling theory reconsidered with a strange apologia in 1963, about the time I stopped reading criminology, I never meant to produce a theory. I only meant to illuminate things formerly obscure. Now, as an apologia, I find that very challenging because for many of us, that is the ultima ratio and hope of what we do, is to illuminate things formerly obscure. So if there has been, if you like, a guiding emotion in my work, and there are some people here, including Suzanne Karstedt, who've written very powerfully about the importance of emotion in criminology and criminal justice, then that is, I think, quite a big deal. And I have a very clear recollection of listening to Robert Mitchum's comments after John Wayne got a Lifetime Oscar. Well, John has been in the movie business for 40 years, and this is the first time he's won an Oscar. I think that speaks for itself. I've been luckier than John Wayne in my awards, but not in my riches or in my height. But principally, I've been fortunate, first in finding an area, or more accurately, as Letizia has demonstrated, a set of connected areas in which few scholars had worked very much before. And so in part this is a tribute to being lucky enough to be an early beginner. Second, in feeling free to pursue what interested me and what might interest others, although I have to say that for some decades, relatively few academics were interested. And finally, having supportive family and friends, including my sponsor, Letizia, who has constructed a herald of my achievements, and my ex-PhD students who are here, like Nick Lord and Alejandra Gomez Cespedes, who are here today. I feel fortunate, too, to be interested by the still unresolved and perhaps unresolvable issues that stimulated me 50 years ago, this year, when I began my PhD. The ambiguities and overlap between white-collar and organized crime, both of them in Levi-Strauss's terms, floating signifiers. And Levi-Strauss has been supporting my waistline over the years as well, as embodied in this great Magritte painting of Ceci n'est pas une pipe. It's the representation of a pipe. Trying to understand how criminals organize themselves and develop their skills, and the evolving social, commercial, and criminal justice controls that they confront, and how these impact on criminal behavior. I feel lucky, even though the complexities of keeping up with these criminal and crime control landscapes keep me chronically over-occupied and under-leisured. So I've had quite a lot of support of different kinds. Perhaps that tree is getting a little bit gnarled and old, and has made me into the kind of person I am today. It's a little bit of a tight fit in there, which suggests that my somatotype, as Cesare Lombroso might have put it, is not ideally suited for a life of Formula One, or even fitting into a Formula hotel would be a problem. But this was actually one of the Ferraris. When I was on the World Economic Forum, we went to Abu Dhabi, not for the races. That would be a declarable, taxable, benefiting kind, of a kind that no Italian or Spanish footballer would receive and fail to declare. And this, after all, is the land of both Shakira and Messi. And my life has been messy, but not in as athletic a way. Oscar Wilde once observed that to love oneself is a lifelong romance. And perhaps that is the leitmotif of my working life. Also, the private and public sector components of the anti-fraud, anti-money laundering, and anti-organized crime complexes, and how they vary over time and between societies, are a suitable object of study in themselves. But these control waves also are part of the routine activities model, which produces crime. And the interaction between controls and the variable supply of motivated offenders to different sorts of economic crime continues to preoccupy me, though RAT, or as I prefer to call it, RAM, for routine activities model rather than theory, did not exist as a term when I started out. Many have argued that criminology is a rendezvous subject, which was meant to be condescending, but can be rephrased as a multidisciplinary subject, which sounds a great deal nicer, but is just the same. Pre and within COVID, a range of criminologists got absorbed in trying to map the fall in crime, and then the impact of COVID on crime of various kinds. I have contributed to those questions too, in relation to cyber, fraud, and corruption in procurement, and it's worth reflecting on the overlap between those categories, as I'm working on now with Suzanne Karstedt and have worked with Russell Smith. But it remains challenging to work out the counterfactuals if COVID and our concrete reactions to COVID, like lockdowns, had not happened. This will be good preparation for the next pandemic, which surely will come, hopefully, in my lifetime. If I speak for too long, my lifetime may be shorter. And criminologists struggle to get the truth and to speak the truth to power. This is an oft-repeated cliche that we try and persuade ourselves about. But it depends on whether those with power are willing to listen to truths. And that is perhaps less the case than it was. And it puzzles me that the European Union's focus on proportionate, dissuasive, and effective sentencing applies to Google. Fine reduced last week from 4.3 billion to 4.1 billion, but still a small percentage of its profits of 76 billion in 2021. Google earned more than 61 billion in advertising revenue, mostly from online search and video platform, etc. It applies to that as much as it does to street and household crimes. But civil Google penalties, or the administrative and more rarely criminal penalties of elite bankers and politicians, are seldom considered by penal theorists, even though Google is a daily component of almost every person represented in this room, and should properly be part of the routines of neighborhood crime, which our politicians tend to focus on still. And what bankers, industrialists, and politicians do affects the environment and our energy prices, internal and transnational migration, etc. So it puzzles me how we can rationally decide what constitutes proportionality. Proportionality to what? Harm and culpability. To what extent penalties can be dissuasive as well as proportionate, and the lack of specification we almost invariably see in claims about effectiveness. Effective at what? Effective at creating the impression that we are doing something, or effective at controlling which behaviors. So what would it take as a minimum sanction or persuasive act to stop Google exploiting its market advantage? If that involved no jail or company liquidation, would that be seen as fair and legitimate by us and or by the general public? And what would we use as our search engine if it did close down? But we cannot focus on everything. We need to look at the different species of trees as well as the forest. Similar arguments could apply to Boeing's 737 MAX, which has just been announced a fine for misleading the market, in addition to all of the other penalties. So Oscar Wilde wrote, "It is only by failing to pay one's debts that one can hope to remain in the memory of the commercial classes." Of course, in the latter part of the 19th century, deception was nearly all offline, except via newspapers and by mail and magazine poster adverts. There were very few telephones, let alone voice over internet protocol, or the sorts of WhatsApp scammers who messaged me this month pretending to be my daughter, who had to change her phone number, and asking me to send 3,000 euros to a West African name at an account which I worked out belonged to Barclays Bank. I got a text scam only today, perhaps from the same people, perhaps not, from someone pretending to be my kid. I'm not as prolific in that direction as they think. And there is a huge spectrum from elite business people and politicians through Farrell and Karstedt's respectable citizens, Paoli's organized crime networks, blue-collar opportunists, and professional enablers like company formation agents, lawyers and accountants, who may not commit crimes themselves, that's an arguable point, but consciously or far less consciously assist others to commit fraud, launder money, etc. What is the right way of going about dealing with those issues, given that at some stage we might want lawyers, and that at some stage we would like them to be able to represent them even if we're multimillionaires, which sadly I'm not. This doesn't mean there are no longer divisions between white-collar crime, organized crime, cybercrime, and money laundering, but it does mean that the Venn diagrams of the denotation of those constructs need to allow for greater overlap. And this overlap is a dynamic process over time and place. To the extent that it's not dynamic, this is because police find difficulties or don't want to develop intelligence sources much outside drugs. And they do not call specialist teams of fraudsters organized crime groups in the way that they do drugs traffickers or human smugglers and traffickers. And analyzing this should keep me busy until I retire or die, whichever is the sooner. US Senator Ben Wade was once asked what his opinion was on heaven and hell. Well, said Wade, I think from all I can learn that heaven has the better climate, but hell has the better company. Appropriately, the first reference for this phrase I could find was in 1885 in the Proceedings of the National Conference of Charities and Correction. Now, given my interest in charity fraud and being a director of the Fraud Advisory Panel, that seems appropriate. But, you know, an ESC in Malaga or Florence might combine both good weather and good company more than was the case in Cardiff, though Cardiff was all right by Cardiff standards. Perhaps the future requires a new lexicon. Leticia put up serious crimes for gain as one of my chapter, which I tried out a couple of times in the Oxford Handbook of Criminology, but has not caught on, maybe because it lacks cultural bite. We remain tribal, hence sessions in criminology conferences like white-collar and corporate crime, organized crime, cybercrime, human trafficking. UROC is trying to broaden this construct. So these reflect what we still regard as our primary orientations. So we might use my category as a higher level organizing principle. I'll cut a little bit out. Though notwithstanding Picasso's birthplace here, we cannot expect Malagueños to read the homage to Catalunya. In my view, we need to follow George Orwell and continuously deconstruct and call out mislabeling. Even modern slavery is ambiguous, in my opinion. It's something that is a good call to action, but it may not accurately represent the behaviors which it refers to. Fewer involuntary migrants or modern slaves in the sense that Jews and others were in Nazi times, or the Uyghurs are in China today. And we live in an era of truth decay, as well as mostly voluntary privacy decay, in which celebrities' obsession with self-advertisement of their holidays or public knowledge of soccer fixtures help to advertise their absence from home and may make high-value burglaries and robberies more likely. Paid influencers, often soccer players or Kim Kardashian, are used to advertise dodgy cryptocurrencies and crypto platforms, both on posters and social media, and regulators need to consider better ways of protecting the public from their own gullibility, unless we adopt a tough attitude to victims' rights and to their own precipitation. At the moment, it seems to be mostly financial compensation by media outcry, which is not a consistent ethical basis for distinguishing between deserving and undeserving victims. Anti-money laundering, I have no time to talk about in detail, you'd be pleased to know. But it does provide, as Letitia's observations earlier suggest, plenty of jobs for people, irrespective of the comments that I, Peter Reuter, and others here may have made about its lack of effectiveness. Nicholas Taleb of Black Swan fame argues that we should not take notice of academics and others who have no skin in the game. This is provocative but sometimes obnoxious position, since those with skin in the game might have a vested interest in keeping it going. And sometimes it takes people from the outside to tell the emperor that either he has no clothes or that his clothes are offering less protection than he claims and or believes. Criminology has taken me to some interesting places. This was District Attorney Robert Morgenthau and me, and the picture doesn't always tell the truth because he forgot to zip his flies up, so I've edited that out. But the emperor nevertheless did have some clothes, they were just incomplete. As one of the original founders of the ESC, I don't mind being a traitor to Brexit. This award delights me, both for itself, for who amongst us is without vanity, and because it reflects the 50 years of work I've done in this field. I'm one of the lucky ones, and of course, much of my working life, like that of many of yours, is filled with less interesting tasks, but compared with my father, who left school at 14, was deaf from birth, and either slept by the side of his tailoring bench or walked 5 miles home and walked 5 miles back in the morning. And my mother, who got polio in the epidemic of 1913 at the age of 8 months and never walked without aids. And I had not met, until I went to Oxford and Cambridge, anybody who had a PhD, let alone come from a family of PhDs. So if they were still alive, which they are long since dead, they would be extremely surprised and gratified to find me here. So mine is a very European story. My father was German. I now hold a German passport. My mother's parents fled what is now Kaliningrad for Britain. They would probably be classified as economic migrants by the Home Office today. So I come from a family of close escapes. You're about to have a close escape because I'm finishing. But mine is a very European story. I remain a European, German as well as British citizen, and I am most honored to receive this award. And this is the Magritte's Philosopher's Lamp, which I hope will illuminate any of my future work. And thank you very much to the Society.
Okay, next, and quickly because time is running out, the ESC's Distinguished Service Award will be present. The president of this jury, the president of the jury of this award is Professor Alexandras Dobrininas. Will take the floor, please.
Dear colleague, probably I have a double pleasure, as first of all as a member of previous jury for awards and the chairperson for the jury of. Oh, it doesn't work. It's working. It's okay. Okay. It's not okay. So okay. Again, just to say again that it's I have a double pleasure because I was a member of previous jury, and right now I want to announce the decision of another jury for distinguished service for ESC award. This jury was consisted of Klaus Boyer, president-elected, Csaba Győri, as a editor of ESC newsletter, and myself, Alexandras Dobrininas, as a past president of ESC. Our jury anonymously proposed Professor Michael Tonry for the Distinguished Service Award. And I would like to invite Csaba Győri for continuing our ceremony with orator.
Thank you very much. My name is Csaba Győri. I'm the editor of the newsletter, member of the EC board. I have to start with your academic output, Michael. And you might say, wait a minute, this is an award that is not about an academic work, but about the contribution to the ESC. But I think these two are interrelated. Because I think Michael's academic background and academic work and experiences were instrumental in his many contributions to the ESC. Michael is from the United States, where he's one of the leading authorities on sentencing and a sharp-eyed analyst of criminal policy, the practice of criminal justice, and their societal and political and cultural context. His thorough but slight and elegant books on these subjects we all have read. Now, many of us Europeans, probably unjustly, view American criminology, at least in its mainstream output, as oftentimes parochial and methodologically and theoretically very compartmentalized. But this description clearly doesn't apply to Michael. He was one of the drivers, with Tapio Lapiseppala and many others, of those fine-grained, data-driven, yet theoretically open-minded and interdisciplinary comparisons that set itself the great ambition of creating a comparative framework for the societal reaction to the analysis for the societal reactions to crime. Again, we all know these accounts from the Crime and Justice series, among others, which remain the source of data and inspiration for generations to come. And why I say this is important, because I think it would be also mistaken to describe Michael as an American. We share his time between Minneapolis, Bologna, and Elba. He has worked at some of the most important centers of criminological research in Europe, including NSCR, where he contributed both in his managerial role and as an academic to many flagship projects of European criminology. I have never asked him, but I never asked him where he feels at home, but I wouldn't be surprised if he answers 30,000 feet over the Atlantic, in between the two. And I think this experience from which his most important contribution to the EC comes. Because he didn't arrive in Europe to create an American independence. And he has always been forceful in his voice in arguing that European criminology is a sui generis tradition. And what follows from this, that if we see it like that, then we have to find our own way in organizing it. We need to create and not copy, even if a copy is just an act of laziness and not our conviction. And even, we have to do this even if this experimentation will have its own failures and dead ends, because the learning process is just as important as the solution. And this is that many long-term members of the board, like Marcelo and me, Julia Roberts and others, as well as the changing members of the board, have deeply internalized. And thank you for this insight. But this philosophy also applies to the general outlook and inclusiveness of the EC. This is a society that shouldn't fall victim, and has not fallen victim, to palace wars between large institutions on ideological camps. Our conferences are not compartmentalized conferences, but in this building there are the people who believe qualitative research is fiction writing, and those building there are the people who believe there are numbers in there, that it must be neoliberalism. It is an inclusive society, and again, Michael was very instrumental in pushing this view in the board and elsewhere. Another important contribution of Michael is the newsletter. He was the first editor of it and created this publication that went beyond usual proceedings of society kind of newsletters. It contains and continues to contain substantive articles, essays. Many of these are still used and cited in scientific publication. When I took over from him, and it's also, I think, very important to mention from the newsletter, he never told me what to do, never explained to me how to do this better. He supported me in everything, and helped mobilize his network, and it really helped bringing really high-profile people to contribute to the newsletter while I was a young editor whom nobody knew. And his final contribution, or the most important, third contribution I would like to talk about, was his work as a president in the last decade or so, which saw the EC transform. Our membership grew continuously, conferences became bigger and bigger, and we were forced on the board with a need of a certain level of professionalization. That was inevitable. And Michael was also instrumental in this, in keeping, of preventing us of becoming too corporate or too business-like, and keep something from the initial informal and interpersonal nature of the EC, which I hope you as a member and a conference participant believe that it worked. But he was also very instrumental in using his academic authority and his managerial skills to help us professionalize at the same time. And the most important here is probably the renegotiation of the contract with SAGE, which was a very contentious process, and Michael was very instrumental in it, in creating or arriving at a contract that is, reflects better the global reach of the EC and the ranking of the ECG. So with that, Michael, thank you for your contribution again, and hope you will continue contributing to the society. Thank you very much.
turned on. You hear me properly? Okay. So those were very, what?
It's not the microphone.
But you can still hear
This. Oh, all right. Wonderful. Now that's a good start, actually. So Zaba's words are very, very kind. I would be a little amazed that the group of you are so kind as to be here to hear this kind of a presentation for this kind of an award. But then I remember I'm sandwiched in between Mike Levy's substantive, intellectually challenging and interesting talk and a serious plenary afterwards. So I don't, my head is not getting too big by thinking that you people are here because of me. You're here because I happen to be in the middle between two interesting things. So it's a little perplexing to receive a service reward. And that creates a second perplexity, which is, what on earth should I talk about when I receive a service award? Now, Mike Levy had reason to give an intellectual overview of issues he cares about and the unfolding of his career in trying to deal with those issues. So I go back to my first perplexity. What is a service award? Well, I could imagine three things I've received this award for. One is that I'm the kind of person who has this exaggerated sense of responsibility. So after a meeting in a conference room, I go around and I pick up the coffee cups and I throw all the paper in the wastebasket. And so I think, well, maybe I'm getting the service award because I'm tidy and I attended these meetings for 10 years. So a lot of other people didn't have to do the tidiness jobs. That's a possibility. A second possibility is that I was on the board a couple times and I edited the newsletter, and maybe I've been given this award because I tried, responsibly, reasonably conscientiously to do the things I thought I was supposed to do. But that's pretty boring. I mean, all of us are supposed to reasonably conscientiously try to do the things we're supposed to do. So I can't really understand that I would have gotten an award for just trying to be a responsible human being playing particular professional roles. That leads to the third possibility, and this is the real one. The third possibility is that I've gotten this award because I have this long white hair. I've been around for a long time, and there was a sense, or there is a sense, that this organization has existed for almost 25 years, and maybe every once in a while it's a good idea, so long as we're still alive to do it, to have some of the older people just talk about the past and the future of the ESC. Well, that seemed to me the most plausible thing for me to talk about. So that's what I'm going to talk about. It's a little bit about the ESC and where it came from and where conceivably it might be going. Now, when we look around this wonderful, beautiful campus and this very impressive law school and realize that there were almost 2,000 people registered for this conference, it's hard not to regard the ESC as, a serious, international, well-established, reputable, scholarly association, and it is. But that's not at all what it began as, and that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about three things. So one thing I'm going to talk about is the early days, and a little bit about what on earth it was we were trying to accomplish, and a little tiny bit on what I think we have accomplished, and then one little cautionary note about the future. So, 1999, I'm an American, as of course Zaba said, and as my accent makes absolutely clear. But I've spent a lot of my time in Europe in various roles. And for a while I was in Cambridge. In 1999, in 1998, at an AAS, American Society of Criminology meeting, I was with a number of people who, in a conversation in which we were struck by how many Europeans were at the American Society of Criminology meeting in 1998. And that seemed kind of dumb, especially because the usual reason Europeans gave for why they attended the American Society of Criminology was, it's the only efficient way to see a lot of Europeans at the same place. So in 1999, there was a small meeting in Toronto organized by Josine Jungertas, then I don't think she was any longer the head of the VODC in the Netherlands, but the Ministry of Justice Research Center, but organized by her and Hans Botellier, who was then one of her deputies, attended by the two of them, Ernesto Savona, then of Trento, me, Cambridge, Hans-Jürgen Kerner from Tübingen, and just 3 or 4 other people. So we had this little meeting of 8 people, and we thought, wouldn't it make a lot more sense to try to get Europeans together in Europe, and wouldn't there be some benefits from doing that? And so we decided to do it. And Josine went back to the Netherlands, and using her influence on her successor as head of the Research and Documentation Center, Henk van de Bond, persuaded Henk to provide the money to support a meeting of about 40 people, which became the founding meeting of the European Society of Criminology, at which the group decided it was a good idea to follow up on Toronto. Okay, so we now have an idea and we have a plan to move forward, but plans don't self-execute. Someone has to do things. We would have no European Society of Criminology were it not for the work of Martin Kilias, who I guess is not here for one reason, and Josine Jungertas, who was not here for another reason. But in the early years, Martin organized the meeting, organized the association, he wrote the Constitution, he did lots of bureaucratic things, including talking to nonprofit lawyer specialists on the subject of what is the simplest country in Europe in which to organize a nonprofit scientific association, which turned out to be England. You could organize an association, but you had no obligation to submit annual reports or financial reports. And so bizarrely, the European Society of Criminology was formally established in England. And although nobody in the world except Martin Kilias, Marcelo Aby, and I knew this, it was officially based at the University of Cambridge for 10 years, and now it's still officially a British organization, but Marcelo tells me he's moving it for good practical legal reasons. So Martin organized it working with a half-time assistant. They organized the first meeting. Josine Jungertas was the entire program committee, about 160 people in Lausanne for that first meeting. Her doing every panel and every detail, Martin booking the meals and booking the coffee breaks and organizing all the activities. So it was because of those people that enough momentum got started. But even then, for 2 or 3 or 4 years, it was only Martin Kilias who kept it going, who kept it alive. Eventually, Martin had this very bright young student, one Aby, who agreed to take on a substantial role, which he's continued to. So we started out as a very, very small organization. When we started, I became the newsletter editor in about 2001. And my theory of the newsletter was that I wanted it to mislead the world. My concept of the newsletter was that it was a document which would make it look like the European Society of Criminology really was something, that there really was an organization there. It wasn't just Martin Kilias working out of his office in the department in Lausanne. And so, you know, I tried to do it relatively professionally. I insisted that we printed hard copies. We always sent 500, we've sent copies to members, but we also sent copies to 500 to 1,000 people who weren't members, academics around the world, research administrators, people in funding agencies. And my logic was, if we look as if we're a real scientific organization, we may be able to trigger a process of reification in which people think there really is a real vital organization that does things and goes on. And all that seems to have worked. And so we fast forward to modern times. Okay, so what were we trying to do? This is simple, you know this. We were trying for the first time to create a genuinely trans-European intellectual community, ideally multidisciplinary, of people who were interested in, as Edwin Sutherland said, the making, the breaking, and the creation of criminal laws. And that seems to have happened. And we wanted to make an association that was completely participatory. Go back to the year 2000, and many European criminology associations were dominated by the senior professors who would decide who was invited to speak and who could speak and even who could attend. And we wanted to make something that was completely participatory, and this turned out to be. Okay, so I'm not giving a scholarly talk, obviously. I think we've been pretty successful. In a vulgar way, we've been successful in that we can say we now have 2,000 people almost here, and we had 150 in Lausanne 20 years ago. That's a sign of success. The second sign of success is there's some number that I don't remember of working groups that are 33. Wow. Many of which are sufficiently well organized that they hold their own mini conferences and they have pre-meeting meetings and so on. And thanks to David Smith, who started the European Journal of Criminology, the ESC now has one of the trappings of a real scientific organization, which is a highly respected, high-quality, scholarly journal that specializes in the subject that Now, those are the reasons why last year, the first time the Service Award was given, but it was done virtually, I think, one of the years we didn't meet, I actually nominated David Smith, Martin Kilias, and Yosin Jungertas in retrospect to receive the first of these prizes because they are the people who made it. I mean, my fiddling around with the newsletter was fine, and it was fun, but the serious work was the organization and the conferences and the journal. And they're the people who really did deserve an award. So here's the cautionary note, and then I stop. So at one time in my life, I walked in this morning, and I was really impressed. I was impressed at how huge this law school is. Right? American law schools are, the biggest one in the country is a third the number of students of this one. But this huge building. And then I was impressed that it was during the first sessions, and there was almost no one in that enormous entry area. Now, if you went to an American Society of Criminology meeting, you would find that during the actual sessions, the corridors are absolutely full of people, as are the bars and the eating places. There are more people at an ASC meeting not in sessions, during the sessions, than there are in the sessions. Now, when I was president of the ASC a long time ago, we actually did a survey, and we discovered that 26% of people registered to give papers did not show up. That was because people could only get their fees reimbursed by their university if they were on the program. But there are many teaching institutions with no research traditions in the US, so lots of people signed up to give papers in order to get paid but didn't attend. And so I was really impressed here, again, as I've always been, that one of the signs we succeeded, I think, in creating the ESC is that during the sessions, almost everybody is there with their bottom on a chair, listening to something that may or may not be fascinating, but it's sort of an obligation of citizenship if you're going to try to be part of this community that you're supposed to take it seriously, and people do. So I think we had a great success. I'm not sure why I get a prize for any of this stuff. It's Martin Kilias and Yosin Jungertas and David Smith who deserve the prize. But I thank you so much vicariously for your participation in their decision to give it to me. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Ellen, aquí mismo. Sí. Ellen? Yeah, yes, over there. Okay. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Ellen Van Damme. Let me tell you. Okay. Let me tell you that the organizing committee of this conference was clear from the beginning that we wanted to dedicate a plenary session to migration. And as you know, in Europe and also in the United States, it is common to analyze migration by focusing on the discriminatory institutional response of host countries to immigration and to try to show that there is no link between immigration and crime. However, for this session, we wanted to pay attention to the countries of origin of migrants, in particular Latin America, because of the ties that link it to Spain, and to try to do so from the gender perspective. For this, Ellen is the perfect person because she studies women, gangs, and migration in Honduras. She is Fulbright postdoctoral researcher at the Center for the Study of International Migration at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she studied female migration from the Honduras countryside to the US. Her research is mostly qualitative in nature and focuses on multi-causal factors of migration, with a particular focus on climate change as a push factor. She holds a PhD in criminology from the University of Leuven in Belgium, and next month she will start working as a postdoctoral researcher at the Free University of Brussels. Congratulations for this new position, Ellen. Without further delay, I give the floor to Ellen, who will talk about gangs, violence, and climate change in Central America, multi-causal push factors for female migration. Please, Ellen, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Elisa. And thank you very much to the organizers, too. Is the microphone fine? I hear it soon. No? Not fine? Is it better now? Yeah, you think so? Okay. So before I will talk about my Fulbright project on women migration from Honduras to the US, I want to take you to the place where it all started, to Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras, where I was conducting research on women and gangs for my PhD. I'll read a brief excerpt from I think we're fine. I'll read a brief excerpt from my field notes. On Saturday, April 13th, 2019, I woke up at 4:30 in the morning to the sound of water filling up the tank on our rooftop. The water taps had been dry for almost 10 days. I rushed down to fill up the bottles we keep underneath the sink in case we run out of water. But Sandy, my housemate, had already been up since 2 a.m., and only now could I hear the voices of people yelling from one house to the other, that the water had finally arrived. The voices were all women. I studied women and gangs in Honduras for my PhD, conducting over a year of field research between 2017 and 2020. I knew the country for a decade now and could not help but notice the increasing issue of water shortage and how women as primary caregivers and providers for the family were disproportionately affected by this. So after my PhD, I moved on to studying migration from Honduras to the US because I received more and more requests to write expert country reports for asylum cases. And I noticed how the whole migration crisis in general was drained with injustice due to a lack of understanding of a very complex situation. People in Honduras do not only migrate because of corruption or climate change, or violence or gang extortions, but because of an accumulation of all of these issues. And if we do not take this into account, then we will continue failing to understand this very complex phenomena. So prior to the start of my Fulbright project in Los Angeles, I conducted field research in a dry corridor of Honduras, as indicated on the picture. I went to remote villages and interviewed women who had stayed behind while most of their family members, both male and female, had migrated abroad. There were no jobs for women because agricultural labor was first and foremost conducted by men, and given these jobs as such were already very scarce, there were virtually no jobs for women. Few people tried their luck to the capital and other bigger cities, but gang and other violence pushed them outside of their country and even outside of Central American region. 3 years ago now, in 2019, the year was labeled El Niño in Honduras and the whole of Central America, as it was predicted to be the driest year in the past decades. And indeed, farmers in the dry corridor lost 80% of their crops, mostly beans, but also corn and other substantial livelihoods. The picture here indicated shows a field of so-called burned beans. They were sown before the rainy season was supposed to come, but then the rain never came. What I increasingly became to understand was that the dry corridor was not only suffering from droughts, but from extreme weathers that no longer followed the pattern of dry versus wet seasons, and crops that were planted were either burned by the sun or washed away by hurricanes. I started my fieldwork for the Fulbright project in Honduras in October 2020, looking for women living in a dry corridor who had family members who had migrated to the US, because I was going to go to the US to interview women there. But it turned out that most women from the dry corridor no longer migrate to the US, but rather try their luck to Europe. Because women who embark on the overland route towards Mexico and the US run very high risks of being sexually harassed, exploited, or raped. Roughly 8 out of 10 women have to face these cruelties. They are so aware of these risks that women, before they leave their country, will go to local clinics to inject contraceptives to avoid falling pregnant after they are being raped. So those who can save up the money, which is about $8,000 that they have to normally pay to a coyote to guide them throughout Guatemala, Mexico, and into the US, those who can save up that money and rather try to get a passport and airplane ticket and go to Europe. During my first interviews in Honduras in 2020, women would narrate their experiences with Hurricane Mitch in 1998, which caused thousands of deaths, made around 1/5 of the population homeless, and set the country back at least about a decade in terms of development. But only 2 weeks into my fieldwork in 2020, ETA, a hurricane of Category 4, swept over the country. My housemate Sandy and I, and luckily Sandy is a biologist, so she understood hurricanes better than I do. We tried to quickly leave the house to still go and buy some food, water, and other supplies, but the rain started to fall very quickly and all the roads got blocked, so we were stuck at home for a couple of days. And then a couple of days later, a second hurricane, Iota, also of Category 4, hit the country, and many more thousands of people lost their houses and livelihoods. It's needless to say that I could not continue my fieldwork because the roads that led to the villages where I was conducting fieldwork were all shut out. So drought, water shortages, and access to water have been a concern for many Hondurans over the past decade. And I went back to Honduras in 2021 to continue my fieldwork. Women have been on the front line to fight for water rights. Prominent environmental activist Berta Cáceres, who you can see on the slide, was killed in 2016 after years of fighting against hydroelectric projects that cut off the indigenous Lenca population from access to water. This happened during the presidency of Juan Orlando Hernández, who ruled the country from 2014 to 2022. People were fearing the privatization of water, and distrust in the government was very, very high. Juan Orlando is currently facing trial for narco-trafficking in the US, and the new president, Xiomara Castro, is the first female president of the country, and people have very high hopes for her, but unfortunately the country's issues cannot be solved by just one president. Indeed, climate change is not the only battle to fight. Climate change and climate injustice coincide with other forms of violence, such as structural violence, gang violence, domestic violence, and so forth, which all form push factors for migration. To give some numbers, femicides have increased with 260 to 300% in the past 15 years, and over a fourth of all women in Honduras suffer from lifetime physical or sexual intimate partner violence. Over a third of all women have been married before the age of 18, and on average 60 cases per day, or over 20,500 per year, of domestic violence are reported in the country. But as we all know as criminologists, this is only a very small tip of the iceberg, because in a patriarchal society, domestic violence is deemed to not be discussed, nor to be concerned by third persons. And so all of these forms of violence are suffered by women in silence, given also research, especially in Central America, and even more so in Honduras, focuses more on violence committed by men than the many forms of violence suffered by women. So during my time in LA, I collaborated on the Mexican Migration Field Research Program by Professor Abigail Andrews, which is a project in which a team of researchers, students interview migrants at the Mexican-US border on the Mexican side of the border. I only very recently, as in last week, received the final data set, so I haven't been able to do thorough quantitative and qualitative analysis. So I will just go over some more descriptive and preliminary findings. I focus my research in this presentation on the Mesoamerican subset, which includes Honduras, and that's a majority in blue, 142 people interviewed, Mexico 94, Salvador 61, and Guatemala 21. And of this, a majority is women. Of the Mesoamerican subset, that's 68%, and for Honduras, it's even 62%. So, as I already expected, based on my previous research on women and gangs, the vast majority of people flee the region because of gang violence. So that's nothing new. But then I also choose like some other factors to focus on, and there I was rather surprised. Because even though in the interviews I conducted in Honduras or with Honduran women, poverty, lack of employment, domestic gender-based violence, climate change were really recurrent topics, they weren't recurrent in the surveys. And there may be several reasons for that. Like, first of all, poverty is so common that very often like people just don't mention it as a reason to migrate because it's deemed as to be an obvious reason. Secondly, regarding domestic violence and gender-based violence, it was questioned in that way in the survey, and very often women just do not identify themselves as being victims of domestic or gender-based violence. And also, like, domestic violence includes economic dependence on the perpetrator, and so it's very difficult in that case to leave. And finally, for climate change, like some causes like hurricanes, the Mitch and Eta and Iota are very obvious, but other reasons like water shortage are less obvious, and so probably that's why it's less mentioned. I will like to show how multi-causal push factors are at play and difficult to disentangle one from another. I will go through 3 cases of women I interviewed at the Mexican side of the US-Mexico border. I will read the quote in English by Erica. She says, "I made the decision to leave my house since 2019. I tried to run away from there in order to not to continue paying extortion to the gangs, because you need to be paying. And my business was going down, I eventually had to close it. And they, the gang members, sent someone to threaten me that if I couldn't continue paying, they would kill me." Erica was 44 years old when I interviewed her, and she left Honduras in 2019 after gang members had killed her brother and started extorting her. So she feared that she too would be killed in the end, so she fled the country. But along the way, she has experienced several traumas. She was robbed by men in Tapachulas, kidnapped in Matamoros. She applied to a permit to stay in Mexico, but she said it's too difficult because also in Mexico you have criminal groups. She was unemployed at the moment that I interviewed her, and she was suffering from diabetes for which she was not receiving any medical help at the moment. Second quote, "I had to get out of there. He hit me like he was fighting with another man, so to say. And once he took a mirror and he grabbed some pieces of glass and said to me, 'Do you want me to ruin your face so that, like I told you, no one would notice you?' So that's when he started to scare me the most. Then he started coming home with guns, he hit me with a bat, so I made the decision to go and leave." At the time of the interview, Letizia was 29 years old. She was living in Tijuana with her new partner. They had left Honduras in 2019 because of the domestic violence suffered at the hands of Letizia's ex-partner. And the way she described the violence to me really seemed that if she would have not left in the end, it would have ended in femicide. Before arriving to Tijuana, Letizia and her partner had been living in Hidalgo, but her ex-partner had tracked her down even to there, so also there they had to leave and move. To make a living, Letizia had been selling pickles. She had worked a clothes factory where she was working 19 hours a day, but now there was barely any work because of the pandemic. And the stress of all of what she was experiencing had set to her body because she only got her period once a year, which also caused that she couldn't have children, for which reason she was also discriminated for not being a real woman. Final quote. "Behind my house, there's a big wall, and when it rained, all the water came down. One day it even overflooded and got stuck. I mean, the septic broke. It flooded because of that. Everything came into the house." And that was during Hurricane Mitch. At the time of the interview, Fidelia, 59 years old, was living in a room in a shared house in Tijuana. She had left for various reasons. Had left the country, Honduras, for various reasons. Gang violence, domestic violence, floods due to hurricanes, unemployment, and so forth. She was also suffering from an illness in Honduras that was very costly to be cured, and she felt she was really a burden for her children who were trying to pay for her medical health care. So at one point in time, she tried to commit suicide so that she would no longer be a burden. And although at the time of the interview, she was in a relationship with someone in Mexico, she was too scared to remain there because of assaults by criminal groups. So the question obviously is, because this is a European Society of Criminology, why should this matter for Europe? Well, it very much matters. To start with, even though Central American migration towards Europe is growing rapidly, scientific research is just virtually completely lacking. For which reason one needs to rely on statistics issued by, for example, the European Commission and newspaper articles. And according to these sources, the number of Central Americans applying for asylum in Europe has increased with 4,000% over the past 10 years. One of the reasons why Hondurans choose to migrate towards Europe instead of the US, as narrated by the women I interviewed, is because for Europe they don't need a visa to legally enter the country. So according to statistics of the European Commission, Honduras belongs to the top 5 of growing asylum applications from so-called visa-free countries entering the EU on a legal basis. Moreover, Honduras has become the third country after Venezuela and Colombia to file most asylum applications in Spain. Among these asylum seekers, women form the majority. For Honduran women, fleeing the US entails much more risks along the dangerous illegal route of Mexico, where they have almost 80% certainty to be sexually assaulted, raped, and murdered. Furthermore, while most Central Americans migrate to Spain and Italy, Belgium, my home country, has become the third country receiving most asylum applications for Central Americans in Europe, strangely enough. And finally, also the United Kingdom reports growing numbers of Latin American immigrants. According to latest numbers, this brings the UK in the top 4 receiving countries of Central American asylum seekers. And 2020 marked the first year that Honduras surpassed all other Central American countries by filing over 5,000 asylum cases to European countries. However, the success rate of being granted asylum in Europe has decreased drastically. They had a success rate as high as 97%, and now it's as low as 10%. And the reasons behind this trend are rather unknown or unclear, but mainly have to do with the lack of scientific research on multi-causal push factors of migration. And I end with some very brief key takeaways on how to deal with climate injustices and migration. First of all, I argue that a feminist and more specifically intersectional framework is needed to study these climate injustices. Secondly, we should reconsider reliance on the Geneva Convention because a convention relating to the status of refugees was established in 1951, which is prior to so-called new forms of violence like gang violence. And in relation to that, categorizing people as climate refugees or people migrating because of climate change takes away the need for a much more complex understanding of the reasons why people migrate from countries like Honduras. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Helen. Please sit with me. We have not time enough, but one or two questions if you want. Somebody? Okay. Javi, please. Very quickly because we have... Over there.
Hola. Good morning, Ellen. First of all, I would like to congratulate you on the presentation. I think that it's an exciting line of research. My question is about the vision that the women you were able to interview had about the responsibility of the administration in their life situation. I don't know if you understand me.
No, there's like
yeah, okay. It's about the vision. Okay. Hola. Sí. Yeah. The vision that the women you were able to interview had about the responsibility of the administration in their life situation.
So, no, sorry, administration in which sense?
Like the state, you know, the I mean the state, you know, the government.
Okay. So if the state is like now taking any responsibility regarding the women, si no me lo puede decir en español, no sé. So let's say like with the previous government and the governments before, like definitely not. because women are just not deemed to be of any like much importance, because it's a patriarchal society. And right now, with the first female president ever, everybody thinks that like she will take care of all those issues, but issues as domestic violence cannot be solved just with one president, because it's so deeply entrenched in the culture. So that's why I always say, because people ask me a lot, like, do you think with Xiomara Castro now there's going to change a lot? No. I mean, I know also from the inside, like, their bank accounts are like completely empty. So even if they want to do something, like culturally changing something, that takes years. So I don't see any change happening during this presidency, and let's hope. There is like a stronger feminist movement coming up in Honduras, so I do have good hopes. But if you see there's like a very big campaign, Yo no quiero ser violada, I don't want to be raped, and there's posters everywhere in the country, but the posters are also like ripped down and like tagged and whatever. So you can see there's still like a lot of resistance. I hope that answered your question, but thank you very much.
Any question?
People probably want to know where the food is.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much again, Ellen.
Thank you.